Africa, Earth's second largest and second most populous continent. Its 12 million square miles account for 6% of the Earth's total surface area. Its more than 1,200,000,000 people account for 16% of the human race. I have had a 2-decade-long fascination with Africa. It started in 1998 when I made my very first of many visits to the continent. I began in Southern Africa with trips to South Africa, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Botswana, followed by visits to Ghana, Senegal, the Gambia, and Liberia in West Africa, to Ethiopia, Kenya, Mozambique, and Tanzania in East Africa, and finally Egypt and Morocco in North Africa. During those visits, I became increasingly interested in governance and particularly what African leaders thought about the development of democracy on their continent. Nearly 20 years ago, I met my very first African leader. He was Samuel Nujoma, the founding president of the Republic of Namibia. I sat with him over lunch at the Presidential Palace, listening on a small transistor radio to a BBC broadcast about his own election results coming in that day. He was running for re-election to serve as president for a third term, which was highly controversial because many of his fellow countrymen felt that he was violating the Constitution, which clearly allowed only 2 terms. The president told me that day that since he was winning by more than 2/3 of the votes across the country anyway, showed that the people wanted him to stay in office for another term, regardless of how some interpreted the Constitution. Almost exactly 10 years after I met President Nujoma, I met with Joachim Chissano, second president of the Republic of Mozambique. At the time, he had become the former president, and he had left office voluntarily after serving the remainder of the term of the first president who had died in a mysterious air crash, and 2 full terms of his own. When party leaders went to Chissano and offered him a chance to run for office yet for a 3rd term, he declined, arguing that as a freedom fighter to bring independence to Mozambique, he was not interested in establishing a dictatorship. He told them that he planned to step down at the end of his 2nd full term. Chissano and I met in his library in the capital of Maputo. I told him that I wanted to help my American students understand governance and democracy in Africa. Chissano told me that if I really wanted my students to understand democracy in Africa, I should bring them to Mozambique while elections were taking place the following year. So in 2009, I began doing precisely that, starting with national elections in Mozambique and continuing in several African countries over nearly a decade. During those years, I had a chance to talk again to Nujoma and Chissano, as well as many other African leaders, including the man who mounted the Mozambican civil war that resulted in the death of over 1 million people. I talked to African journalists, students, scholars, and ordinary citizens. My colleagues and I took our students to observe democracy on visits to Botswana, Ghana, Liberia, Namibia, and Mozambique, where I met with presidents and former presidents. We also went to Tanzania and the island of Zanzibar. Many of these visits occurred when actual elections were taking place. My real interest was to find out what Africans themselves, particularly the leaders, thought about how things were changing in African governance.
A system of proportional representation was adopted for the legislative elections in order to give chance to the small parties to get seats in parliament.
We have learned of the challenges having to do with the dissemination of information and the education of the public. For a society that has not had too many elections over the years, and for a population that is not literate, voting is associated with people. Somebody is running for something and you put your support behind that person. It's personal driven. But here's a referendum on an issue, on an idea, not a man or a woman.
Many observers outside of Africa are likely to think only of stereotypes they have had of Africa and Africans. That was true for the most part of my students.
Before I took the course for African Democracy Project, the only experience I had, about Northern Africa was National Geographic. When I was little, I watched it on TV, so it was everything we just saw, some of the ethnic groups of Africa, and then you also see commercials about Feed the Children. So you just have ideas of like extreme poverty with knowledge that there is a city and that they do have a political system, but mainly they just show the worst things about Africa. So you assume Africa is a country, not an entire continent, that's made up of 50 plus countries and that they're all the same, but I didn't really know anything to differentiate that from what I learned.
As a person who is very interested in people politics, not just the in-depth course politics, I'm really interested to see how people really feel about topics, not just the basic answers that we get from textbooks. I want to understand why people feel the way that they feel and get to know people better.
Over the last 5 to 6 decades, the world has seen images of tribal conflicts in Kenya, Sudan, Somalia, Rwanda, and Darfur. At various periods over decades, they saw famine and starvation in Ethiopia, disease and health crises of Ebola, malaria, and other diseases in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And they heard about HIV/AIDS virtually everywhere. There were wars in Sudan and Chad, domestic terrorism in Somalia and Nigeria. They saw civil wars, wars of secession in Nigeria, Mali, and Ethiopia, military coups, state collapse like Somalia, and just general chaos at one time or another across the continent. These are the horror stories that many in America, including my students, carried in their minds every day from images in mass media and increasingly from social media. These become persistent stereotypes, and they carry over to the images we have of African leaders. But I sensed that my students began to see something most Americans could not see. Before they went on these visits, these students were no different from others who had never visited Africa. We will see that overwhelmingly, after their visits, the students thought that African countries were truly trying to become democracies. I saw that when given even limited exposure to Africa, people's views changed drastically. Over centuries, Africa has evolved through various forms of governance. Pre-colonial Africa possessed perhaps as many as 10,000 different political entities. Beginning in the late 50s and early 60s, African states began to gain independence, either peacefully or following wars of liberations, rebellions, civil disobedience, or other actions. After independence, peace rarely followed. During the period from the early 1960s to the late 1980s, Africa had scores of coups and at least 13 presidential assassinations. There were more than 200 attempted coups and countless plots that never got launched. Borders and territorial disputes were also common, with the European-imposed borders of many nations being widely contested through armed conflicts. Cold War conflicts between the United States and the former Soviet Union played a significant role. It was a world of alignment with one side or another. The superpowers played a game of you are either with us or you're against us. More recently, Chinese hegemony has increasingly concerned many African nations and their leaders on the continent. However, some African leaders seem particularly receptive to increased Chinese presence.
All along, the Chinese people have been very friendly to the people of Africa. Even before colonialism and the whites' invasion of Asia and Africa, already there has been some commercial trade between the people of Asia and Africa. So Chinese are friendly to African people.
So when somebody is coming to invest, when a Chinese is coming to invest from a country of 1.2 billion with cities that are about 18 million, if you take Ghana, Ghana is what? A slightly larger size than Lagos state, with 24 million. So we need stability in West Africa. We need people to invest in West Africa.
Over the centuries, wars and periods of starvation, political unrest, and liberation from colonial regimes have all led to a continent still in change, still developing and still struggling, but nevertheless growing in their observance of good governance. A well-known Sudanese businessman, Mo Ibrahim, has said when you ask Europeans or Americans about African leaders, the first thing they mention are the bad apples. But there is another side. A diverse Africa which across its many cultures, history, and peoples is making tremendous progress in addressing its problems and its future. This is an Africa with leaders who are increasingly more sophisticated and prepared for leadership than we imagine in our world of African stereotypes. This is an Africa whose citizens have increasing expectations of their leaders. In order to provide objective measures of African democracy, in 2007, Mo Ibrahim initiated the development of the Index of African Governance. The key components of the index are safety and rule of law, participation and human rights, sustainable economic opportunity, and human development. Each of these components provides quantifiable measures of critical dimensions of governance. Citizen participation is but one of the elements of good governance in the index, but it is an important one because it measures citizens' ability to express themselves about their government and their leaders through the practice of elections and other forms of good citizenship. In addition to establishing the index, Ibrahim also established an award which would be given every year to a former African president who exemplified good governance in his leadership as president. The controversial award came with a significant cash gift to the former president that continued for the remainder of his or her life. As a result of his resolve to step down, which was unusual for an African leader, Joachim Chissano was the first African president recognized for achievement in African leadership by the Mo Ibrahim Foundation.
The way we do things are all done in a democratic way. You don't have to say, it's democracy. You do democracy. You don't speak about democracy, you do democracy.
According to the Ibrahim Committee, Mr. Chissano's decision not to seek a third presidential term reinforced Mozambique's democratic maturity and demonstrated that institutions and the democratic process were more important than the person. I was fortunate to meet and talk with 4 of 5 of the recipients of the Ibrahim Award for this documentary. Those Ibrahim recipients I met were Joachim Chissano, 2nd President of Mozambique, Festus Muhai, 2nd President of Botswana, Hifikepunye Pohamba, 2nd President of Namibia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, 24th President of Liberia, and first female president on the continent. This documentary is framed principally around these conversations and those with 5 other presidents, as well as other African students, activists, and some ordinary voters on their election day. In my discussion, I wanted to learn from them what are their hopes and dreams? Where do they think African democracy stands? What do they see as their nation's challenges? What do they think about corruption as an obstacle to good governance? And finally, are they optimistic for the future of democracy on the continent?
Ghana is one of the countries that decided that democracy and people's participation was the answer. From about 1991, Justice Daniel Annan, D.F. Annan, of blessed memory, who was our first Speaker of Parliament and had been a member of the PNDC, was tasked with the responsibility of going around the country and asking Ghanaians, what kind of government do you want? And so we had what we call the National Commission for Democracy or something like that. And they went around the country and they presented their report. And the report said overwhelmingly that Ghanaians wanted to return to a multi-party democracy with all the protection of freedoms of the citizens, free expression and all that. And so President Rawlings allowed a consultative assembly to be set up. Up to that point, any electoral process would have brought the elites back to come and draw up their constitution. So it was decided that it should be a consultative assembly where the people will be drawn from recognized groups. And so the TUC, the Butchers Association, the hairdressers, the automobile workers, everybody was asked to send representatives to the Constitutive Assembly. And they bequeathed unto this nation the best constitution we've had so far, which is the 1992 Constitution.
Africa is ensuring the implementation of all the objectives of democracy. But we have had our fair share of the challenges inherent in democratic dispensation.
And the newspaper, like the Namibian, was deemed to be a communist infiltrated opposition to the South African government. There was no freedom of the press, and the press was divided on color lines. There were the newspapers that were for the white population and the newspapers that were for the black. So apart from the armed struggle and the diplomatic struggle that was fought outside the country, we also had the struggle inside the country, which to a large extent was carried by the churches through the Council of Churches, but also through newspapers like the Namibian. And I think it built up a credibility of being critical and open and honest, and that 25 years after independence, they are still critical.
We have media that goes to the left, we have media that goes to the right, and it is so everywhere. I think to a large extent, it probably is a mirror of the diversity of our society.
Well, I think all along, Africa and its people have been practicing democracy, but their democracy was violated by the forces of colonialism and imperialism who invaded our continent and colonized us. So democracy is not new to Africa.
First, most African countries had to achieve independence before developing their own forms of democracy. Upon the arrival of the Europeans, self-governance in much of Africa ceased. The Berlin Conference, held in 1884 to 1885, was an important event in the political future of the continent. It was convened by King Leopold II of Belgium and attended by the European powers that laid claim to African territories. It sought to bring an end to the scramble for Africa by the European powers. They set up the political divisions of the continent to suit their own interests to meet their economic needs back home. Imperial rule by Europeans would continue until after the conclusion of World War II, when almost all remaining colonial territories gradually obtained formal independence.
Quando essa bandeira subiu à meia-noite e 25 de junho, choramos de alegria. É ou não é? Por quê? Por causa da palmatória? Não. Por causa de cavalo marinho? Não. Porque estávamos tristes? Não. Por quê? Por quê? Por quê? Por quê? Assim estamos livres. A coisa mais bela que há na vida de um homem é viver livre, é viver independente, é ou não é? Pode não ter comida, pode não ter roupa, mas é livre.
Aujourd'hui victorieux, je vous salue au nom du gouvernement congolais. À vous tous, mes amis, qui avez lutté sans relâche à nos côtés, je vous demande de faire de ce 30 juillet 1960 une date illustre que vous garderez ineffaçablement gravée dans vos cœurs, une date dont vous enseignerez avec fierté la signification à vos enfants, pour que ceux-ci, à leur tour, fassent connaître à leurs fils et à leurs petits-fils l'histoire glorieuse de notre lutte pour la liberté.
Well, the biggest obstacle at present is that those who are in power, the minority is in power. They are like one riding on the back of a tiger. And they really want almost a watertight assurance before they get off the back of the tiger, because they feel if they get off the back of the tiger, it will eat them.
We were a colonized country, and we fought to liberate ourselves. The liberation was for us to bring democracy to Namibia, replacing the apartheid system in our country.
Namibia is one of those countries which had to struggle, wage a war for democracy. It took us about 21 years of armed struggle. That is after we have been at the UN petitioning, we even went to the International Court of Justice. Liberia and Ethiopia, who were the only members of the League of Nations, took the case on behalf of Africa. But using the technicality that Liberia and Ethiopia didn't have a legal standing between the case to the court, the case was thrown out. So when that happened, we have to either submit and accept slavery or to stand up and fight. So in Dar es Salaam, clarion call was made that we are our own liberators. We didn't expect UN to free us. So we crossed many rivers of blood until we achieve our independence.
Africa contains 54 sovereign countries, most of which have borders that were drawn during the era of European colonialism. The vast majority of African states are republics. They operate under some form of governance involving a constitution, presidential rule, a legislature, and a judiciary. However, for the first 10 to 15 years following independence, few of them were able to sustain democratic governments uninterrupted and on a permanent basis, and many instead cycled through a series of coups, civil wars, tribal conflicts, or secessionist movements, producing political instability in much of the continent.
There is a new African in the world. That new African is ready to fight his own battle and show that after all, the black man is capable of managing his own affairs.
Democracy is not inborn. Democracy is cultural. In North Africa, we saw the Arab Spring, which was an explosion of the love of freedom, of humanity. Democracy is where humanity devises a means to secure the freedom, to protect it, and to advance it, to govern itself and to ensure law and order in the system.
To a very large extent, once the opportunity is there for any party to contest, where there's free and fair elections, where there's level playing field, I don't see why there should be a military intervention now. Of course, those who are governing also have to make sure that they don't make the mistakes and repeat the mistakes of the past and take the people for granted.
Democracy is really taking off throughout Africa. We have now 30 functioning democracies at different levels of maturity, but democracies nevertheless in which there are open societies where freedom of expression, freedom of choices are exercised, where there are regular peaceful transition of power. But as I said, different stages. But we're pleased that Africa has come a long way as a result of 2 decades of reform in economic and social structures.
One attempt to unify the continent around a common cause was partly the reason for the formation of the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, in 1963. After decades of working toward getting countries to cooperate with one another to build a stronger Africa, in 2002, the OAU formed and then launched a new organization, the African Union, or the AU. The founders' vision for the AU was that of a multi-member body of African countries that would help to create an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa, driven by its own citizens and representing a dynamic force in the global arena.
AU is giving fantastic leadership to the continent as a whole. It's this AU at the beginning of this century that emphasized the need for Africa to open up using the building blocks of the regional groupings. It addressed it. It's this AU that also emphasized the critical role of the private sector. It's on this basis that it asked for partnerships, both from within and outside of Africa, so Africa can leapfrog into the mainstream of globalization. And all the countries are now adjusting to democratization, respect for human rights, respect for inclusiveness, and also improve the quality of life for their peoples. So AU is doing very well.
Yes, I think we should strengthen the African Union more with the clear purpose of ensuring that in our lifetime, the United States of Africa will be implemented, where Africans will carry one passport with one president. So we will be one continent as we were before the invention of colonialism and imperialism.
I mean, when I look at the AU,
yes,
I get frustrated. There's a lot going on in Burundi. Nobody's talking about it. People are getting slaughtered. You see pictures of mass killings, etc., and a lot of, brutality. You don't hear African leaders condemning that. They don't speak against it. You don't see the AU taking any action, being at the forefront of anything. Then we say, the international community and the media, and they're always focusing on the wrong things, and, nobody's paying attention to Burundi, etc., etc. But you're there. It's how many years after independence? We can't keep running to the West.
Today, our market women cross borders and go across to look for food, to look for garments, to look for things that they can take from surplus country into deficit countries. And they do it at tremendous risk because the roads are not there, because our institutions of border management sometimes have not reached the level of sophistication where systems can assist. And sometimes they get harassed. Customs officials, immigration officials who may not have the level of understanding as to the need for these cross-border movements. But those are the things that we are trying to address through training, through information sharing, to ease the market women who go across. But more importantly, to build the infrastructure and to build those institutions whereby you can have an ease of movement without going through these kinds of difficulties.
As president in 2016, we went for the AU meeting, and they discussed the protocol on free movement and the issuance of an African passport. And so after we discussed it, a few countries objected. So when I came back, in Ghana, we unilaterally went ahead. And so if you come with an African passport from any country, you can get a visa on arrival. I believe that the AU has started to move on it. If they're able to do it, then we can travel freely with an African passport across the continent. That would be a major, major advancement.
So with this awareness that we are at a disadvantage unless we came together, we are trying to overcome the artificial boundaries, not just the physical boundaries, but even the linguistic.
We still have a serious language divide, whether at the top level, summit of heads of states, or whether at other lower levels of institutional gathering. The ability to communicate one-on-one on issues is constrained by the language divide. So most times you have to have an interpreter, you have to have a translator. We try to overcome it because our objectives are common, our goals are common, our commitment are common. But it remains a constraint that will not be addressed until we address the language barrier.
Brothers, I think I have spoken enough in this language. It is not my wish that I should be speaking to you in a foreign, and for that matter, in colonialistic language.
Once we're not using our own languages, we leave the integrity factor behind in that culture of ours, in that language of ours, and we speak, let's say, the white man's language, let's say the English language, without integrity. It has become very opportunistic, but at the same time, it is the language that has power.
I think it's the responsibility of all member states of the African Union to ensure that they educate their people, that they belong to the African continent, and this is what the youth should be brought about, that they must work hard, they must make sure that the United States of Africa is achieved in our lifetime.
We are better than average, but we're not very good. No, we're not very good. We're not excellent. There's a lot to be done. You have a lot of heads of states who are staying on beyond their term. You have countries where laws are being changed to suit individuals who do not want to leave power for one reason or the other. You have countries where there are a number of human rights abuses going on, and the African Union appears to be incredibly silent on some of those things. ECOWAS, on the other hand, I think is doing a bit more, because with protocols like the trade protocol that allows for the free movement of goods, the immigration protocols that allow for the free movement of people across borders, these are things that are affecting lives, that are affecting economies, that are affecting businesses, in the sub-region. So we begin to feel the effect of that regional group more than we feel the effect of the larger African Union.
ECOWAS, which stands for Economic Community of West African States, was formed in 1975. There are 15 countries that share geopolitical and common economic interests. One of their goals is mainly to develop their economies through cooperation and integration. ECOWAS also plays a limited military role through joint forces from member countries, removing the need for non-African forces on the continent. It has aided in several peacekeeping missions in the Ivory Coast, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, and the Gambia. The Liberian Civil War that killed more than 250,000 people was resolved in part by ECOWAS and the United Nations.
I think there was the first test that a continental sub-regional body could, take direct intervention to try and stop, fighting in another country. Now, what it does is it shows that there's a collective interest in what happens in our individual countries. So rather than wait for a civil war to occur and send our soldiers to die, we said, look, let's make sure that there's more citizen participation. Let's make sure there's more democracy. Let's make sure there's more freedom of speech in every country so that we don't have to send our soldiers to go and die in any country.
Liberia is an effective participating country in the West African community, what we call the Economic Community of West African States. And today we meet regularly in summit. We have institutions that meet on security matters, on development matters, on cross-border matters, on international matters, and they feed their discussions and their recommendations to the summit, and we take those decisions on a, you might even say, on a regular personal basis. President to president, head of state are always in contact with each other. If things do happen in one country, immediately talk to each other about how we can have a common view and a common response to issues that are arising.
It's not just coincidental. I mean, that they've really done well because the leaders who formed it at the time in the 70s when the ECOWAS started, you would reckon there was a lot of military dictators around at the time. So it was easy for them. Protect your place, I protect mine, I don't interfere in your affairs. So it was a nice agreement. When I'm killing my people, you don't say anything. And to a large extent, that still remains. That's why the Gambia would do what it does, and most of our leaders would pay lip service to it. They would go there one time maybe to try and, for the cameras, say we're going to speak to Gambia about all these things, but then behind closed doors, only God knows what is said, because you realize, like you mentioned, these dictators remain and still are members of these groupings.
SADC is the Southern African Development Community, and its goal is similar to ECOWAS. It seeks to further socioeconomic cooperation and integration, as well as political and security cooperation of 16 Southern African countries. A similar organization, the East African Federation, comprising 6 countries, has been formed in East Africa. The EAF would be a more integrated federation than ECOWAS or SADC. These regional communities are evidence that African nations seek to play a greater role in governance on the continent, to provide for itself through cooperation, and to play a strategic role in its governance that outsiders played during its colonial and post-colonial past.
We have to take history seriously. Liberia is in the rising again. I would say it was through ECOWAS that peace was secured there, mainly through ECOWAS. I happen to have also had a hand. Mr. Taylor decided to step down. I was the chair of ECOWAS. And even since he left and our sister Johnson Sirleaf assumed office and I was still in power, Ghana supported her in restoring some of the basic things.
After the Accra peace talks and democracy returned in 2006, you might say in many ways Liberia was starting from scratch. You know, rebuilding the institutions, getting people back in places, being able to address the huge infrastructure destruction that existed. So it's a tremendous task, and sometimes people forget when they try to compare Liberia to Ghana or to some of the other West African countries, they forget this whole period of destruction where we have to overcome. The idea is to make sure we learn from those lessons of experience, so that never again we can go back into a self-destructive situation, and we can use what we have for the good of the country to make sure that every Liberian feels like they have a future that has prosperity within its reach.
In addition to continental organizations and regional communities and federations, a few countries exert strong individual economic, political, and military power. South Africa, Nigeria, and Ghana play significant leadership roles on the continent in different ways. For example, Nigeria is an economic and military powerhouse in Africa. It is the richest in oil after Egypt, and it has the largest economy by gross domestic product. While it is only one of 15 countries that make up ECOWAS, it has the strongest military. Nigeria is a federation whose central government holds large swaths of power that place an emphasis on controlling federal monies. In fact, thanks to oil reserves, Nigeria was able to pay off the last of its multi-billion-dollar debt to the Paris Club in 2006, one of the few African countries with such economic strength. But Nigeria has internal conflicts unlike virtually any other African democracy. It has an insurgency terrorist group called Boko Haram. Since its independence from Britain in 1960, it has frequently had religious clashes between Islam and Christianity, which are roughly equal in size in the population. It has had a civil war and attempted secession of its eastern region, known as Biafra. Although it put down its secessionist movement, there is still a huge divide between the oil-rich states and the federal authorities. Woven among coups, military rule, and civilian governance, the country held several elections, most of which have been shadowed by charges of corruption, fraud, and lack of transparency. All the while, Nigeria has also had several constitutions. The country is currently presided over by Muhammadu Buhari, a former military leader who also served as a former president as a result of a coup. Observers generally praised his election as being fair. Outgoing President Goodluck Jonathan conceded election results without delay, which kept unrest resulting from the loss by his party to a minimum.
Nigeria is a mighty, mighty nation of population of over 160 million. of very powerful tribes who could be nations in their own rights, because you get the Hausas numbering over, is it 30, 40 million? You get the Yorubas again over 40 million. Those today, Igbos and others, also much bigger than many of the rest of us. So holding all these disparate forces together hasn't been easy. Fortunately, they are a federal system, so they can each find some niche to express themselves and also to hold their own, even within the bigger whole of Nigeria. So this is West Africa. It's emerging, but history will tell you why certain things have happened as they are happening.
South Africa, though only fifth in population among African nations, is seen by many Africans as the type of country that has many advances and often measures up against a number of Western countries in commerce, sports, medicine, and sheer potential. Among the 5 largest African countries, South Africa is the only one that has never had a coup d'etat. However, the true independence of the masses of its population followed only after the collapse of apartheid. Apartheid was an institutionally mandated separation of the races and disenfranchisement of non-whites, which was roughly 4/5 of the population. South Africa occupied the conscience of the world because of its blatant racist policies against the black majority and the bigger-than-life presence of one man, Nelson Mandela. During his trial on April 20th, 1964, in a 3-hour speech, Mandela spoke heroically about his quest for justice. He spoke of his yearning for democracy, freedom, and harmony among all people. Mandela said, "During my lifetime, I have dedicated my life to the struggle of the African people. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all people will live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to see realized." Looking directly into the eyes of the man who was about to sentence him, perhaps to death, he closed by saying,
"If it needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die."
Mandela was sentenced to Robben Island and other prisons for more than 27 years for conspiring to overthrow the state.
After 27 years, his head was high and his fist was clenched. Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison today like a chief of state, flanked by his first lady and by the men who'd been hired to protect him. There they were, the South African state.
When he was released from prison, he negotiated an end to apartheid that led to the first truly free election in the history of the country. He stood for election as the standard-bearer of the African National Congress and was elected president. He served only one term and stepped aside to be succeeded by his deputy, Thabo Mbeki, who later was unceremoniously ousted as head of his own party and resigned the presidency toward the end of his second term. That led to the election of Jacob Zuma, who was subsequently caught up in several scandals and charges of corruption that led to his resignation before the end of his second term. South Africa has struggled with corruption at the very top of its leadership. It has a multi-party system where the ANC, the founding party, has always won. In its most recent turmoil, there was serious doubt that the country could handle the corruption charges in Parliament against a powerful incumbent president and an entrenched party, but it did. Zuma was succeeded by Cyril Ramaphosa, who became the 4th president under true independence. He won his party's nomination by a slim margin and now struggles against the forces his predecessor left entrenched in government. It is not clear how Ramaphosa will survive and fulfill his promise to bring an end to corruption and a new day for his country. The democracy that Mandela bequeathed to the nation, the continent, and the world struggles to bring about an equitable society after decades of apartheid. Mandela's successors did not have his stature and did not bring the prestige to the office that he did. The current president is faced with a nation rich in resources but suffers from a weak economy, labor and political opposition, and the same maldistribution of wealth that there was during the years of apartheid, particularly for the vast black population. In post-apartheid South Africa, the wealth gap remains high as white landowners retain the majority of property, leaving a vast population of frustrated black citizens as the African National Congress fails to bring about significant change. A limited number of wealthy blacks has emerged, forming as much as an exclusive club as the wealthy white landowners.
You know, in South Africa, they have two issues, the economic power, which is still dominated racially by the whites, and the other side, and then political power, which is in the hands of the black. But even that is not being used to support the masses. South Africa has enough resources, and also when you see the difference between the well-to-do sides in, say, Cape Town, just on a hill, you can see this, and very close by is the poverty. It's too close. I think South Africa has had two miracles. They need a third miracle. The first miracle, de Klerk, and then Nelson Mandela. I consider de Klerk as being one of them because, look, to give up power is not easy. He could have fought for 10 more years and killed a whole lot of people before being removed. And Mandela, to graciously accept power and say, I'm not bitter, let's move together. Sure. And I think what they need is a third miracle, which is a president who comes in, has a social conscience, and tells everybody, what can we do to lift the people at the bottom up? Investment, employment, education, this is what we are going to use the money for.
Yes, within South Africa, you see some seriously disadvantaged parts. But there's also a powerful industrial force that is manufacturing practically everything. Parts of South Africa are perhaps better developed or advanced than some parts of Europe.
Among African states, Ghana is considered by citizens across the continent to have the strongest institutions, an independent judiciary, term-limited presidency over the executive branch, and a well-structured multi-party legislature. Illustrative of its stable democracy through strength of its institutions is the outcome of the 2012 presidential elections. The main opposition political party disputed the results and went to the Supreme Court against an independent National Election Commission. The incumbent, John Mahama, had been declared the winner with 50.7% of the vote, and his major opponent, Nana Akufo-Addo, who had 47.7% of the votes, challenged the results in the Supreme Court. The winner had to clear a 50% threshold, which the Election Commission said Mahama had done. No election results had ever been challenged since Ghana put in place the 1992 Constitution, the nation's fourth. The dispute in the Supreme Court lasted until late August the following year, fully 8 months after the results were declared by the Election Commission. The entire country was on edge as the drama played out in the Supreme Court on television every day. On August 29, 2013, the Supreme Court of the Republic of Ghana convened right here in this building to hand down its ruling. It observed that there had been some irregularities and malpractices in the conduct of the election. In a 5-4 decision, however, it reaffirmed that despite these shortcomings, the charges of the plaintiff were not sufficient to overturn the election of John Mahama as the president, as had been declared by the Election Commission. Akufo-Addo and his party accepted the results, and Mahama continued to govern, and Ghana resumed normalcy. In the very next presidential election in 2016, Mahama and Akufo-Addo met again. This time, Akufo-Addo won in a landslide. I had been in the country with my American students for the 2012 election. The students had the opportunity to be observers of the election and the demonstrations during the days that followed. We were at the Election Commission when the results were announced.
As election observers, we got to see how they vote and how they tabulate, and it was very refined and not something that I expected from a developing democracy. And we went around just asking people, how long have you been waiting? And some of them said since 10 p.m. the night before. And so we're talking 16 hours and they're still waiting, and they all say, my vote counts. I'm here because my vote counts, my voice counts.
For them, the rallies, they're not only able to support their candidates, but they're having a lot more fun, whereas at a rally in the United States, you're sitting in a chair, listening to someone speak, and they make it a lot more exciting.
My perception of democracy, sort of when we went over there, it was very one-dimensional. There's no such thing as a 100% pure democracy, and that's what I learned in Botswana, and it really made me come back here to the United States and see that, well, theirs isn't perfect, but ours isn't either.
In the United States, we might not have the best knowledge towards Africa, and I think that it's a huge disservice for everyone. I think a lot of people in the United States have a preconceived notion of what Africa is like. I did not see the Namibian genocide in any history books, but I was very intrigued to learn there are a lot of parallels between the Holocaust that we just know about and the genocide that occurred in Namibia.
One thing I absolutely found fascinating was the amount of voter turnout that they have there. But they were just so adamant about voting and how important it was. You know, they had, I think it was something 80% voter turnout compared to the United States. With the last election, we had about 50% or even less than that. So I was amazed at just how much the people cared about their country.
We're talking about a country that has had, you know, you could count on one hand the number of elections they've had since their inception. And so, you know, they are at a totally different level. It doesn't take away, though, from the fact that they are emerging as a democracy. But I think outside powers have to understand that the democracy in Liberia is not going to be something that can be measured or compared to developed countries right now. It's something that is a work in progress. But it's something that we have to leave to the people of Liberia to figure out what they want their democracy to look like, the shape they want it to take. It definitely cannot be something that is imposed on them.
I think the NAC did a wonderful job. They had all of the material. I did not see anyone that did not get enough material or the correct material. And all the poll workers were there, all 6 at every station that I was at. And just the organization that they had was very well done.
Voter turnout across African countries have been high over the years, while the more industrialized countries of the West have seen very little change or an actual decline in overall turnout. When I brought my very first group of students to Africa for the very first time to observe an election, they were very excited, but they had low expectation. Then they saw the Africans' commitment to democracy.
The African Democracy Project, Mozambique, has totally transformed me. What I learned is that there were people who were willing to fight but didn't know the channels, or the government was so powerful that they were afraid to even say. I mean, sometimes they would say one thing to us personally, but as soon as the camera started rolling, they were like, oh yeah, you know, out of fear.
Oh, I'm supposed to do that? Yes, right. Yes. That's my girl.
In talking to average citizens, I heard things like, we don't, you know, we like the help from the government. We need the help, but we don't want to rely on the government for everything. We want to be self-sufficient. And again, that's, you know, coming from both sides, I found that very refreshing.
I think I just had this idea that multi-party elections were good, they represented the people, and that if this is what they were switching to, this would be a good thing for them. I had no idea of the complicated, intricate details, naively so, I have to say. But and as I learned more about it, I thought, this is really the global phenomenon.
I also do believe that democracy should be a system in which different oppositions have equal chances of being a part of the electoral process and actually winning. And with Mozambique, for the past 30 years, they've had one political party in place. And for me, I thought to myself, is this really multi-party democracy, or is it just dual party or one party, basically? And with Frelimo and Renamo, it was dual party, and I was so glad that MDM did come into the picture this election to basically change things, and it did change things. It might not have changed with the presidency, but there was a shift in the political spectrum in the way Mozambicans regarded their democratic process this election.
The elections here were very fascinating. The biggest thing I noticed was probably the dedication and the passion, as the lines were extremely long, which you don't really see in the United States. The people were going to the polls sometimes 1, 2 in the morning, and they were waiting in lines that had hundreds of people just to cast their vote. They feel like it was their civic duty, and that's how important it was to them. And I don't see that in the United States with a voter turnout sometimes of 50 to 60%, where here we are getting upwards of 75% to 80%.
Experiencing politics in another country is a good way to see politics in your own country. Because if you're able to see outside looking in, then you're able to see inside looking out.
The level of interest in democracy in this country is something we talked about when we were in the States, but it's really amazing to see, and I think that was the thing that we had studied that was surprising to see here. Just going to the election polls yesterday and watching the people stand in line in pouring rain, waiting to vote, the excitement about it, the fact that it was really a big process for everybody that they were involved in. All the news, the radio, it's all been about the election. So the interest in democracy has been something that, again, is unique in my experience.
You know, it's easy to see democracy in the U.S., for example, because I'm used to seeing democracy in the U.S., and I've always seen it. But I've always heard, you know, oh, Africa, most countries in Africa don't have democracy. So when I was able to go to Ghana and see people on election day standing in long lines to wait, that was so amazing to me.
Well, if we think about democracy in the States and democracy being based off a majority rule, well, African Americans like myself are always in a state of being a minority. And so to participate in democracy in the States is to assume at some level that you will never really have the agency to make democratic political decisions for yourself without always having to comply. And I think maybe that is comparative in ways, if we think about Ghana or people on the continent, in ways where their families are split. People may migrate because of drought, because of access, and then their political interests are split in the same way.
In my discussions, I wanted to learn from African presidents and other African leaders what were their hopes and dreams. In spite of frustrations and setbacks, leaders are for the most part hopeful, and they aspire to have a greater role in world affairs as a united continent. While there are internal conflicts and disputes, there are currently no significant border wars since the secession of Eritrea from Ethiopia. For the most part, there is peace on the continent. When asked about peace in Liberia after the Civil War, Lima Gaboyi stated,
"There is no joy in the joy of building peace with sisters. No one has experienced this joy until you form a movement like this one. It's sincere. It's genuine. There is no fakeness in it. It's all about Liberia. It's not about me right now. The song we sang say, even if you beat me for peace, I'm satisfied. Even if you are violent to me because I'm non-violently protesting peace, I'm satisfied. Because for us, it's not about the politics of this country or the wealth of this country. All we want, each and every one of us, is to live in peace, grow old in peace, have our children in peace. And so today, their presence here is just to send a signal out to the Liberian people that tomorrow, peace is the only thing that we want.
Where do they think African democracy stands? African leaders are realistic in their assessment of progress on democracy in Africa. When asked about this, Johnson Sirleaf said,
when it comes to political institutions, we have a functioning democracy in terms of our politics, but has not reached the level of institutional maturity. So you have many strong political leaders, that provide the guidance, the lead for their institutions, but the institutions depend largely on them and their strong influence, their strong authority. And that's where we're working on now. How do we institutionalize the politics of Liberia so that it transcends any one strong, influential leader?
To what extent has African countries shared governance with local authorities? African governance tend to be highly centralized, with much of local government controlled by the national administration. Stemming the tide of corruption and a monopoly on government funds that are not necessarily used in the citizens' best interest are the reasons decentralization of government and fiscal responsibilities have been encouraged by political activists.
Local government takes care of local activities. You know, there's something called decentralization, and local government has to interpret national policy. For instance, sanitation. The whole country is engulfed in a sanitation problem. Then you have to localize it. So the local government that is made up of the district assemblies, and then the municipal authorities, they handle those issues. And these are supposed to be grassroots problems.
Governance, all the components, the transparency, the accountability, the responsiveness, the accurate responsiveness, the responding to the actual needs of people happens better when the center is close to the ordinary people, as close to the ordinary people as possible. We don't have that right now, because even though we have a decentralized system and we have a local government and all of that, first of all, they are not accountable to the people, because they are pointing power elsewhere. But on the other hand, they also get financing from the center. So really, what is the motivation for the gentleman to respond to the needs of the people? You don't do anything for him.
I'm definitely optimistic that decentralization is a worthwhile mechanism to advance democratic development. But case study evidence and the emerging empirical evidence shows that it has to be decentralization done well. So you need to look at the specifics of how that is implemented and how it's working in order to make it a type of mechanism that will do that.
We've decentralized authority from the national level into the regional level and right into, what do you call it, the district level. Yes. So that people in a way have felt that they own the political climate.
To have strong mayors running the regions, you also need maturity at the top, so that whether I belong to the same party or not, whatever belongs to that constituency or to that district, I'm going to give it to them. So maybe we needed to go through this process, mature at the central government level, and then be able to say that you can be a mayor in Accra, you belong to the wrong political party, but still you participate at the national level when there are meetings, so that your people would not feel, once they've elected you and you belong to the opposition, that they have to get rid of you in order to get the benefits that belong to you by virtue of being a district.
There are members of local assemblies voted by the local people. But the question is, what powers do they really have? And that's why when it comes to local government elections, you find that whereas national elections are, you're posting probably 70%, 80%, voter turnout. Local level, you're barely making 30%. Because the people don't have an interest. Yeah. Because they know that the guy that's going to be there, he's going to make a lot of noise, he's going to speak, he's going to do, that is if he ever even feels the need to. Mm-hmm. But then at the end of the day, nothing really is going to come out of it.
Decentralization is a major priority of this government. Mm-hmm. We started with what we call deconcentration, to make sure that we begin to push the determination of priorities, the exercise of authority away from the center to the periphery. In terms of fiscal matters, making sure allocations from our budget, rather than before all centralized through decision making, they now go to our political subdivisions for that.
What do they see as their nation's challenges?
Our economy is not throwing up enough jobs to be able to absorb them. We have young people finishing university and they can't find jobs. And that is why
one of the major things we must focus on is to push for growth with jobs.
Mozambique is a country that is rich. We have resource, good land for agriculture, timbers, even this coast that is rich of fishing, but Mozambique still be poorest because this government doesn't have good policy for development.
The greatest threat to democracy is disillusionment and believing that situations like Rwanda are better. And if people believe that this idea of freedom and talking and expressing yourself is not delivering economic well-being, they would rather prefer or say, some people would say, it's probably better to shut down all these noisy radio stations, stop all the crazy politicking, and let's get someone who can just give me food to eat. And I think that would be a tragedy.
African leaders are realistic about the challenges they face. They agree on education, health, youth unemployment, and restlessness. But what do they think about corruption?
Corruption is the biggest ever threat. Look, if a system is corrupt, nobody thinks about the state. And when nobody thinks about the state, nothing goes on, even up to the courts. If corruption is rife in a country, people can buy their way through everything. And so the system doesn't work. And if corruption is in the country, there is another big problem. The bigger problem is that government doesn't have money. People have money. So nothing goes on. And then corruption brings indiscipline. If a population is indisciplined, you can count it. We go nowhere. So for me, for all that we are doing, and most of the corruption comes from our so-called, the people who praise us. Today in this country, foreigners bribe their way through everything. How come the Chinese are in this country so much and they are, digging everywhere? It's because people in authority brought them. The rumor is that MPs and ministers go for the concessions, they go to China, buy the equipment, bring the Chinese, come dig and get gold for me. That's corruption. I take corruption as a virus in a computer. It destroys everything.
The politician is usually corrupt. I mean, you don't get any good out of them. People collect bribes at the immigration. You come into the country, you pay bribes to the policeman. You pay bribes to get your electricity connected or disconnected. We are paying bribes for water, for banks. We do all those sort of things.
If corruption is a threat to democratization in Africa, then I would say it's equally a threat to the sustenance of, say, Western civilization or the emerging BRIC nations, including China. Corruption is decaying, and decay threatens all lives.
The fight against corruption should be more in 1, awareness, 2, prevention, and 3, sanctions.
In Africa, in general, we are still growing. I mean, compared to the advanced countries, we are getting there, but I hope someday you will not hear about any corrupt anything, and I'm trusting that we have dedicated and integrity, leaders who will take our position.
Well, in lots of areas, Botswana people are encouraged to start up businesses, basically do anything you could do in a democratic country. We do have cases of corruption here and there. I should think that such would be expected in any country, really.
In the end, I think that the results would actually show what Ghanaians want. You cannot really interfere too much with the voting here, as far as I know.
They are not in agreement and as willing to admit the role that corruption might be playing in holding back the advancement of democracy.
I survived for as long as I did because of the golden rule, doing to others as you would wish them to do to you. Mm-hmm. I survived as long as I did because I was sensitive to the aspirations of our people. I survived as long as I did because I did not inflict my will on the people. I spent 30-40% of my time actually watching out for corruptible things and fighting corruption because of the ease with which, the climate is easily taken advantage of by people in positions of authority, And mind you, I survived as long as I did because I did not abuse my office. I did not act with impunity. If you can give people a leadership of integrity, they will put up with any amount of pain when they know you're not exploiting them.
Let's take a look at some data from the Ibrahim Foundation. In 2018, the index ranking for participation and human rights on a scale of 0 to 100 ranged from a low of 17.5 in Eritrea to a high of 77.2 in Mauritius. 10 African countries showed declines in participation scores, while 43 showed increases, several by more than 10 points. The consensus among Africans I talked to is that democracy in Africa is getting better. Their judgment is based mostly on the fact that elections take place and human rights are mostly respected. In many cases, the press is relatively unrestricted and talk radio is widespread and rambunctious.
If I want my government to be run in a certain way, then it's my responsibility to make sure that I vote. You know, I don't wait for the next person to say, go vote. No. It is entirely up to me.
I would say Botswana is one of the relatively most democratic countries around in Africa, more so because we have free and fair elections that are supervised or regulated by the IEC. That's the commission that's in charge of supervising such. And you know, everybody can vote. People are actually encouraged to go out there and cast their votes. They want, our government encourages people to choose a government that they're most comfortable with and that they would like. You know, they don't force anybody to do anything.
The Ibrahim Index of Governance report gives mixed results for Africa as a whole. The good news is that the overall index for the continent shows slow improvement. However, the overall index on a scale of 0 to 100 is just approaching the midpoint at 49.9, improving only 0.1% since 2008, and roughly the same minute amount since 2013. Basically, this leaves the overall governance score flat for more than 10 years. Of the 4 subcategories, safety and rule of law and human development barely exceed the midpoint at 52.6 and 52.8 respectively, while participation and human rights at 49.2 failed to reach the midpoint. The 4th, sustainable economic opportunity, was well below the midpoint at 44.8. Let's look at the 3 nations we examined as playing significant roles on the continent. In the 2018 report, Nigeria is regarded as showing progress over the last 10 years, with the rate of improvement increasing. Ghana also shows progress over the last 10 years, with the rate of improvement increasing. South Africa, in contrast, shows a decline over the last 10 years, but currently bouncing back. What about the 5 countries whose presidents were recognized by the Ibrahim Foundation for leadership in overall governance? Again, the results are mixed. Botswana shows a decline over the last 10 years, Cabo Verde declined by almost a full point, and Mozambique declined by nearly 3 points. When the same countries were compared specifically on participation, Liberia and Namibia also shows progress over the last 10 years. The others showed similar deterioration in participation as they showed overall. It should be noted that Botswana and Cabo Verde, which showed declines in 2018, had very high overall scores and participation scores in previous years. So in spite of their declines, they were still much higher than most other countries and Africa as a whole. Mozambique, however, showed significant decline from what was, at best, poor scores in previous years. Finally, are these leaders optimistic for the future of democracy in Africa? In the end, democracy on the continent is struggling, but slowly improving against many obstacles. Leaders are hopeful, but realistic. My students saw this and expressed it best.
It seems to me that they are struggling with exactly the same issues that the rest of us are. How to care for a population that is sick and potentially dying without a tremendous influx of resources.
We debate about government involvement and healthcare and how we don't want our government to do this, we don't want our government to do that. In Botswana, we saw that the ARVs for people infected with HIV were provided for free because the state felt that it was its duty and responsibility to take upon such matters. So maybe we have it backwards.
I was able to get a lot of hope from being in Ghana. That's the main thing I took with me. Ghanaians, they didn't feel like, oh, if my candidate doesn't win, I'm going to have a huge hissy fit. They were just like, you know, I want so-and-so to win, but if he doesn't win, it's okay.
When it comes to the city life, it was very shocking to me that South Africa had such a huge industrial and very up-to-date modern economic society. Coming here, I've learned so much more about its history, its people, and its culture.
I don't see why there should be any reason that Mozambique cannot achieve the level of democracy that the U.S. has. It just needs some time. The Civil War occurred in the 1970s, and it just recently ended in the 90s, so it's a brand new country. But I think that it will be achieved. I think it is going to take some time, and it's going to take a few lessons, but they are going to find those individuals and those leaders that will take them towards their future.
You know, I was surprised to see just how in love these people were with their country. Everybody kept saying it's all about Mama Liberia. And I thought that was such a powerful thing, to think that there are people who are still so, you know, not just out there to get stuff for themselves, but they were thinking about the greater good of their country.
To say that I am hopeful that democracy will be achieved anywhere at a certain time, that is to say that perfection is reached at a certain time. Democracy is always an act in progress, always constantly being revised, and if it is not, then it loses its actual trait of democracy. But I believe it has to do a lot with how much we are challenging democracy here and in places where it is already established. That will really weigh how soon in that relative scale we get closer towards a more stratified democracy in Africa.
I think that the initial impression is the resilience of the people. It's absolutely amazing how people have developed a personality, I guess, that is so open to everybody. And there's extremely strong political divisions, if you will, but there's no sense of violence or frustration or anger with any other political party. People simply want to express themselves, and they want the world to know, I think, what they have done since the war ended.
Are they optimistic for the future of democracy on the continent?
We have the neighborhood effect. When Ghana is doing things in the right way and Nigeria begins to do things the right way, it will be infectious. It will ripple all across.
There are times when I'm very optimistic and I feel, look, we've got to make it work, even if there's little to look forward to, etc. I lived out of this country for 12 years.
Yes.
I came back with no intention of going anywhere. I still have the opportunity to go if I want to. But for me, this is important. Yes. Project Ghana is important enough.
Well, I think there's hope for Africa. The future is bright. I mean, in terms of the next frontier for development is in Africa. And I hope that our brothers in the diaspora have to come home and help us with their knowledge of their little experience in democracy, their in IT. We need to develop the continent. And we can only do that with our brothers and sisters wanting to come and have a base here. And the sky is the limit.
I'm a great optimist in this regard. If you look across the continent, you find that more and more there are open societies. There are institutions that are requiring accountability on the part of their government. There's more participation by citizens. There are regular, free and fair elections.
With the help of ICT, all over the country now, people know what's happening around the world. And I believe people believe that humanity is moving into the era of people's power. And that's democracy for me.
Look, you cannot be a pessimist and be an African. Okay? Africa is to be built on optimism.